Today we're going to tie the Jack Daniels, and this fly was originally created by Cory over at Old Dominion Trout Bum. With this fly's less flashy, more natural appearance, it's a great complement to your fly box full of hot tags and hot collared nymphs. With our thread attached, we can wrap back to the bend of the hook so we can tie in our tail. Our tail for this fly is going to be some CDL fibers, and I like to go with about 4 to 6 fibers. I like to get a couple loose wraps around the fibers, and then I can just pull those tags to get that tail to the length that I want. Now that I'm happy with the length of the tail, I'm just going to wrap forward with touching turns, or as close to touching turns as I can, and trim the butt sections out. Here I'm using a 12-aught thread, but something like a 7D denier or an 8-aught thread would be a lot easier to flatten out and get a nice smooth body. You can still do it with this 12-aught, but it's just a little more difficult. We want a thin, slightly tapered body. So you'll notice we're wrapping about 80% of the way, flattening our thread, wrapping back, wrapping 50% of the way, then wrapping back to the behind the bead, and then wrapping 25% of the way back and wrapping back, always trying to keep that thread as flat as possible. Once you're happy with your taper, I like to do one more wrap over the whole body with a nice flat thread and end with my thread back at the back of the hook. The rib on this fly is super easy. You're just going to use your thread and then just color that thread black with a black Sharpie, and then go ahead and wrap that thread forward to right behind the bead. This 12-aught thread is really thin, so I like to have a lot more wraps of this ribbing on the body. If you're using a thicker thread, you can maybe space those out a little bit more. But you'll see here, I got them pretty closely spaced, but I think it looks pretty good. With our thread up behind the bead, we can now coat that whole body with some UV resin. Here I'm using some Solarez Bone Dry, so it's nice thin coat. We don't want to add any bulk to the body of the fly with this UV resin, but it will help smooth out the body if you had any rough spots from wrapping that thread. With a nice thin coating of UV resin on that body, go ahead and hit it with the UV light to get everything set so that we can move on to the next steps. This UV resin can be really slick on the fly, so I like to get a little bit of a thread base ready for my thorax. We're going to start the thorax of this fly off with an extremely small bit of dubbing on the thread. We got a decent amount of materials going on here right behind the bead, so we definitely don't want to crowd the hook. This thin dubbing noodle is also going to help keep that thorax tight to the bead and not going too far back on that thread body that you've made. When wrapping your thorax, don't forget that we're still going to tie in a CDC collar, so having this be a nice round thorax is going to help that CDC stay out and really move in the water. Now it's time to tie in our CDC collar. I've always liked just tying in the tip of the CDC feather and wrapping that stem, but using a dubbing loop or a split thread technique also works great. For the 12-aught thread that I'm using, I might go more towards a dubbing loop, but if you're using a 7D denier or an 8-aught thread, splitting that thread could be a great option. With how I'm tying in this CDC feather with the stem, I find that using a pair of hackle pliers really helps keep things where they need to be when I'm tying this off. CDC collars work best when they're fairly sparse, and this was a fairly good CDC feather, so I'm only going to wrap once around the hook. Sometimes if your feather is a little bit more sparse, you might need to wrap twice, but here one time did the trick. I like to tie off my CDC collars with a wrap behind the stem, a wrap in front of the stem, and then I like to grab all of the material and pull everything back and get a wrap or two in front of everything. This just helps have all those CDC fibers going back towards the fly. With everything tied down, you can go ahead and get those scissors in there and trim off the tip of that CDC feather. With that stem trimmed out, you can go ahead and get in there on those CDC fibers, and with your fingernails, go ahead and rip those to length. You could just whip finish the fly right now, but I think it kind of cleans things up a little bit if you come back in with an extremely small dubbing noodle and just get a wrap or two of dubbing around the hook to cover up all those thread wraps and the tie-in of that CDC collar. Now with all of that stuff hidden, you can come in here with the 3-turn whip finish and finish off this fly. Now that you've got a whip finish or two on this fly, you can go ahead and trim that thread out and you have yourself a Jack Daniels Nymph. Thanks for watching.